They were built by the ancients in a time before Christ, to a scale that's unbelievable. They dared their creators to push engineering to new heights, which still astound us today. Architecture and sculpture continue to stand in the shadow of their genius. Now, by revealing the secrets of the past, we can unlock the mysteries of their construction, which earned them the highest distinction as the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Great Pyramid is the only survivor of the 7 ancient wonders, the finest monuments of all time. The others have fallen, taking with them the secrets of their history and construction. They laid the foundations of human achievement, becoming the building blocks of modern architecture and sculpture. From the world's largest pyramid to the very first skyscraper, the 7 ancient wonders were all massive construction projects. They challenged their creators to conquer the scale of their ambitions.
The 7 ancient wonders are a great example of how people build to impress, build to a scale which seems almost incredible, almost as if they were intending to make people look at them and say, well, could this have been possible?
To solve nearly insurmountable construction problems, visionary architects were forced to conquer the unknown with extraordinary results. There were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, built high above ground, displaying their color in the middle of a desert.
I'm most intrigued by the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. I wish it was still there. Of all the 7 wonders, that is the one I wish had not been destroyed. It's so unusual. It excites one's imagination.
Exotic and mysterious, they have enchanted us through the ages. Standing upon an arid plain, how were the Babylonians able to conceive them? The ancient gardeners had a great knowledge of horticulture, but what plants were they able to grow in the Hanging Gardens? The first cranes were used to construct the world's largest marble temple. It was supported by a forest of fluted columns 60 feet high. How were the ancients able to achieve such detail while working on such an enormous scale? Using simple techniques, they overcame the most difficult problems. Solid marble lintels weighing 40 tons were lowered with hair's breadth precision.
It was one of the examples of the ways in which these early Greek architects were responding to the desire to build huge edifices with huge blocks of stone and needing new technologies to cope with it.
An ingenious technique was used to create the finest sculpture of all time, the giant statue of Zeus, lifelike in every detail. How was it possible to create a statue of ivory taller than a 4-story building?
The overwhelming flash and brilliance of all the materials at that scale is something we can only imagine in our minds.
The sculptor who created it used a secret recipe to shape the ivory. But how did he achieve such realism? The originality of its design has inspired artists and sculptors to copy it throughout the centuries. The Pharos, a lighthouse, was the world's first skyscraper standing over 400 feet high. How were the ancients able to build so high without modern equipment? The Pharos blasted its golden light 50 miles out to sea. What mechanism could cast a beam so far? For centuries, the secrets of its construction lay hidden beneath the sea.
So we are on the place here, on the underwater site.
Now, a marine archaeologist and his team are recovering its remains from the sea floor to discover how the Pharos once stood. The 7 ancient wonders created the building technologies of today.
It was the invention of the crane by the ancients that enabled them, and now us, to lift heavy weights high onto a building.
The ancients dared to build high. Until little more than a century ago, the Great Pyramid remained the tallest structure on Earth. Only with modern engineering have we mastered the technology to build higher, giving rise to our finest skyscrapers, and even buildings made out of glass.
One thing I learned to respect the Egyptians is the proportion of that pyramid. The Egyptians were right 4,000 of years ago.
The ancient builders took risks to attempt the impossible. Now, nothing is left to chance.
The computer has allowed us to test designs that before we couldn't have tested, and that's given us the confidence to actually proceed with these designs and be daring. A good example of an early use of the computer was Sydney Opera House, which was a very unusual structure.
Today's creations stretch to the heavens, but their foundations are embedded deep in the past. They rest upon the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which still challenge and amaze us after thousands of years. Their origins lie in the ancient Greek world. The 7 wonders of the ancient world stood within the Greek Empire, created by Alexander the Great. He conquered every country to the east, as far as India, and south to Egypt. Alexander transformed the Greek world. In the wake of his conquests, Greece entered a golden age of brilliance and sophistication.
The idea of 7 wonders is in many ways inconceivable without Alexander the Great, because his conquests in the East are what create the greater Greek world in which the wonders exist.
Alexandria, the city named after the Greek general, became the most splendid city in the world and the center of all knowledge. Here in the 3rd century BC, the very first list of the 7 ancient wonders was drawn up.
Alexandria was the great center of learning of its day, with a very famous library. And one of its greatest scholars attached to the library was Callimachus. Callimachus wrote a book of the wonders of the world, and it is possible that in that book he gives a list of 7 wonders that we have today.
Callimachus's book was destroyed. Now the earliest surviving list of 7 ancient wonders is found in a poem or epigram from the 2nd century BC. It was written by a Greek, Antipater of Sidon.
I have gazed on the walls of impregnable Babylon, along which chariots may race, and on the Zeus by the banks of the Alpheus. I have seen the hanging gardens and the Colossus of Helios, the great man-made mountains of the lofty pyramids, and the gigantic tomb of Mausoleum. But when I saw the sacred house of Artemis, that towers to the clouds, the others were placed in the shade, for the sun himself has never looked upon its equal outside Olympus.
But why were there 7 wonders?
The symbolism of the word 7 probably goes back to Babylonia, where we get the origin of the 7-day week, for example. And that seems to be related to the idea that there is a lunar month of 28 days, and that has 4 phases, each of 7 days. The Greeks thought there were 7 planets, including the moon and the sun. So there was a natural basis to this idea of 7 being an important number.
After Antipater, the list of 7 wonders changed over the centuries, as successive civilizations included their own achievements. The Romans added the Colosseum. Christian writers included Noah's Ark and the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Today's accepted list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was compiled during the Renaissance. When the Dutch artist Maarten van Heemskerk arrived in Rome in the 16th century, he was so impressed by the city's classical treasures, He made a set of engravings depicting the 7 ancient wonders.
He was undoubtedly influenced by the Roman monuments that he saw there and used them as part of the basis for the engravings which he did to represent the 7 wonders.
Heemskirk's engravings bore little resemblance to the actual 7 wonders. 6 of them had already been destroyed, and he wouldn't have seen any evidence of them. But his works define the accepted list we recognize today. They were the Pharos of Alexandria, the tallest lighthouse; the Colossus of Rhodes, a giant bronze statue; the Temple of Artemis, the largest marble temple; the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the most elaborate tomb; the statue of Zeus, lifelike in its detail; the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, greenery in a desert; and the foundation for them all, the Great Pyramid. Although all 7 wonders lay inside the Greek Empire, only one stood within mainland Greece. In the 5th century BC, Greece was invaded by Persian armies. By 480 BC, the Persians had taken Athens, destroying much of the city. But the Greeks fought back and defeated the Persians. Within 10 years, the statesman Pericles came to power. Athens was rich from the spoils of war. Pericles commissioned monuments glorifying its victory, including a new temple to the goddess Athena, the Parthenon. It was decorated with lavish friezes. The most famous are known today as the Elgin marbles. The finest Greek sculptors worked on the Parthenon. Pericles was so impressed with one in particular, named Phidias, that he made him the chief designer. Phidias would become the Michelangelo of the Greek age. Phidias was asked to make a statue of the goddess Athena to stand inside the Parthenon. Crafted from ivory and gold, he designed it to stand 40 feet high. Statues and monuments were being commissioned across the country, and artistic rivalry was intense. Phidias was determined that his Athena would outshine every other statue in Greece.
Phidias' great achievement was to meet this challenge, and after he made the Athena, virtually every other Greek town wanted such a statue.
Phidias was heralded as a genius, but his name became blackened by scandal. On completing the Athena, he was unable to account for all the gold he had used. Phidias was accused of embezzlement by those eager to bring down his powerful patron. Fortunately for Phidias, news of his spectacular Athena had traveled to Olympia. He was now commissioned to make a statue of Zeus to stand inside the temple there. So, in 438 BC, to escape the scandal in Athens, Phidias left for Olympia. The site of the Olympic Games was dominated by a temple. It awaited Phidias' masterpiece. The Olympic Games attracted competitors from all over the Greek world. Wars stopped when the games were held in honor of Zeus, the supreme god. Phidias arrived in Olympia to take up his new commission. With his reputation on the line, he approached the great temple.
So it seems that the Eleans, having seen or heard about what was up in Athens, decided, we want one of those too, and we want Phidias to make it for us. And they went and they commissioned him to do that.
Until Phidias, Ivory carving had only been executed on a small scale. Phidias designed the Zeus to be taller than a 4-story building. It would fill one end of the temple. It was too large to be carved out of solid blocks of ivory. So he developed a technique which has never been surpassed.
The structure of ivory is such that you can unscroll it. You have to imagine it as if you're unpeeling an onion or putting a pencil in an old manual pencil sharpener and turning it, and you get a thin, narrow shaving strip of ivory. And no one had tried to do this before, and that's really what was original.
Phidias developed a secret method for softening the ivory. Only a few ancient recipes survive. Professor Kenneth Lapatin is the first to have rediscovered them.
Some seem to be a bit fantastic, like wrapping them in fish skin, which I have never tried to do. Others say boil 3 days with mandrake root, which seemed a bit dangerous to try. Others said soak in oil, which did nothing for me. But one said soak in vinegar, which I did do, and that produced results. And what happens is that the ivory, which is tooth, it's largely calcium, has some of its chemical components leached out of it, and it becomes soft and flexible. And then you can mold it to shape and dry it out, and it will maintain that shape. And it was Phidias' genius that assembled these techniques from various different crafts to make this wonder of the world.
Phidias and his assistants painstakingly followed this technique of shaping every detail. Every ivory section was made to fit exactly. The Zeus began as a wooden framework. To this, the molded ivory sections were fastened. The statue was built up, piece by piece, to a height of 45 feet. It took over 7 years before Phidias was satisfied everything was perfect. The Zeus was then assembled inside the temple.
It had a great reputation, but none of that really prepared you for that shock when you walked through the temple doors and saw the image. Unlike, I think, all of the other wonders, you couldn't see it from afar. You had to go and enter the temple, and then it hit you all at once. Oh, gee, that really is big. Wow.
The writer Strabo, in the 1st century AD, was critical of its revolutionary composition.
The sculptor may be criticized for not having appreciated the correct proportions. He has shown Zeus seated, so we have the impression that if Zeus moved to stand up, he would unroof the temple.
The Zeus sits still. He's holding his emblems of power, the victory in his right hand, the scepter in his left. But he's not doing anything. The stilling of the god gives him greater power because there's the potential there for action. He's very aware. And it's that calmness that becomes a hallmark of the classical style.
Characteristics of Phidias' world wonder are echoed throughout Western art. From Byzantine images of Christ to 20th century statues of American presidents. In 1914, Daniel Chester French began work on the Lincoln Memorial statue. Using the same composition as the Zeus, Daniel French made the Lincoln statue out of 28 pieces of marble. Phidias had been meticulous in his study of light, but Daniel French discovered on a dull day his sculpture looked flat. He had to install an elaborate lighting setup. The scale of his sculpture was also criticized, this time for being too small. Daniel French had to double its dimensions to satisfy his commissioners. Even then, the Lincoln statue was only half the height of Phidias's Zeus. Over 450 years after Phidias's world wonder was made, Roman soldiers and workmen arrived with special orders from the Emperor Caligula. He had instructed them to bring the statue back to Rome, so he could put his own head on it. Legend recalls the statue let out such a loud cackle of laughter. The scaffolding collapsed and the workmen fled. Luckily for them, the ruthless emperor was assassinated before they returned to Rome, empty-handed. By 391 AD, the Christian Church banned pagan cults and closed the temples. The Olympic Games ceased, and the great sanctuary of Olympia fell into disrepair. When the Zeus was 800 years old, it was bought up by Luasus, an imperial chamberlain from Constantinople, installed in his palace art collection there. Phidias's world wonder would not survive for long. A fire destroyed the palace and the collection, cremating the finest statue of all time. The influence of Greek art and architecture spread into Persia, an enemy of Greece. At the western tip of the Persian Empire lay the once great city of Halicarnassus. It is now the small resort of Bodrum, lying in present-day Turkey. At first it appears an unlikely site for a world wonder. But in the 4th century BC, this was the capital of a powerful sea empire. Inland from the harbor lie the ruins of a tomb, the most extraordinary building ever constructed. It stood the height of a 14-story building, combined an assortment of styles, and was covered with statues. It has left us the word Mausoleum, used to describe monumental tombs ever since. Its style has been copied around the world, from the Freemasons' Lodge in Washington, D.C., to the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, Australia. The creation of this incredible structure was down to the vision of one of history's little-known yet extraordinary figures, King Mausolus. A Persian governor or satrap, he became king of this area, known as Caria. Mausolus's unusual behavior included marrying one of his sisters, Artemisia. Erratic and headstrong, he founded a dynasty upon tyrannical control.
Mausolus married his elder sister Artemisia, which is a very curious thing to do because brother-sister marriage does not seem to have existed in the family before his generation.
From the day he became king in 377 BC, Mausolus fiercely protected his kingdom. The ruins of the Mindus Gate are all that remain of his grand defensive walls, which stretched for 7 miles around the city. He also built up a navy of 100 ships.
In the Persian tradition, he had a fortress palace, which is believed to have occupied the site currently where the castle is. Mausolus is obviously a very powerful, dominant figure, successful politically and victorious in war.
His forces stood poised to repel any Greek attack. Yet, Mausolus openly welcomed Greek culture. Deluded by visions of his own grandeur, he planned the construction of a vast tomb. He chose a Greek architect to design it. His name was Pythias. He was unknown and unconventional.
We don't know exactly where he came from, but he was very much a pioneering theoretical architect, probably the most important theoretical architect of the 4th century BC. He had very strong views on what was appropriate in architectural design and what was not.
The Persians had a tradition of building tombs. Mausolus followed the example of the Persian king Cyrus the Great. But Mausolus's tomb would be far grander. Pytheas designed for him an extraordinary building. It defied the conventional styles of the day. Apart from the Great Pyramid, it stood twice the height of any known building in the Western world, 14 stories high. The tomb would be unique. It would incorporate different styles from different countries. On the top, and never attempted before in architecture, a vast statue. Below, a stepped roof, inspired by the Egyptian pyramids. Beneath were Greek columns from temple architecture. Under these, giant statues resembling friezes, another architectural innovation. At the base was a tomb chamber. This alone used over 12,000 tons of stone. Mausolus gave orders for his tomb to be built on top of an existing royal burial site. Because of the scale of the tomb, this choice of location presented problems. The mausoleum needed foundations dug to a depth of 20 feet. They soon flooded. Having drained them, Pytheas increased stability by joining the masonry together. Iron clamps, or dovetails, were used to secure each block to the next, and dowels were fitted between the courses. To assemble the columns, a hole was cut in the base of each, allowing iron connecting bars to join onto the next section. This technique is still used today.
These blocks have been banded together so that they get strength from each other. The ancients also realized that for stone blocks to share the weight more effectively, particularly on a large structure, they needed to be clamped or doweled together. If there was a weakness in the foundation, for example, then the building could cope with it better.
The mausoleum became a world wonder because of the statues adorning it, over twice life-size. These heroic figures stood high up on ledges and weighed many tons.
By the time that the mausoleum is being built, great strides have been made in the development of cranes and siege engines, massive timber constructions on wheels capable of lifting dead weights to a height of 140 feet.
We take it for granted that we can use machinery to help us on our construction sites. This beam weighs about 1.5 tons. It was the invention of the crane by the ancients that enabled them, and now us, to lift heavy weights high onto a building quickly and with great precision.
The heaviest statue sat on the very top of the mausoleum. It was an enormous sculpture of Mausolus and Artemisia in a chariot, pulled by 4 horses. This revolutionary idea of putting a statue on the top of a building has been copied since in triumphal arches and monuments. Mausolus never saw his completed tomb. He died in 352 BC. His body was interred within the mausoleum. But Artemisia, his sister and widow, would prove to be more formidable than Mausolus himself. After the death of Mausolus, Artemisia became queen. Her rise to power was unprecedented in the Western world. She continued to oversee the construction of the tomb. Throughout her short reign, she demonstrated her strength. Her bravery in war led the Persian king Xerxes to exclaim that his men had become women and his women men.
There is the famous story that the Rhodians decided to attack Halicarnassus after the death of Mausoleum, when Artemis was in control, thinking presumably they could easily overthrow a feeble woman. But she outwitted them and in fact captured them, and then returned to Rhodes with the Halicarnassian fleet and captured Rhodes.
Although she appeared to be invincible, her brother's death had weakened her spirit. Her decline was so tragic it was later romanticized by Renaissance artists.
She seems to have been completely besotted with her elder brother, to the extent that even after his death she is supposed to have mixed some of the ashes of his remains with her wine and drunk it. Possibly this is one reason why she didn't outlive him by many years.
Artemisia ruled for just 2 years before she died. She was interred alongside Mausolus, her brother and husband. They were carried away to the next world in their chariot. The mausoleum was finally finished after Artemisia's death. Her younger brother and sister also married before the dynasty died out. The mausoleum remained an object of admiration until the 15th century, when an earthquake destroyed much of it. The stone blocks were used for rebuilding the castle of St. John in the harbor. Most of the statues, which had made the mausoleum a world wonder, were thrown into lime kilns to make cement. "100 miles up the Persian coast from Halicarnassus stood the largest marble temple ever constructed. It had been built at Ephesus, the wealthiest city in Asia Minor and the largest port on the Aegean. The temple, dedicated to the goddess Artemis, attracted pilgrims who flocked here to visit her cult shrine. Artemis was a mother goddess, her many breasts symbolizing the fertility of women. King Croesus, renowned for his wealth, financed the building of a temple to her in 550 BC. The architect chosen to build it was Chersiphron. Although he was highly trained in temple construction, this commission was on a scale never before attempted.
One of the interesting things about temples such as the Temple at Ephesus are that they are among the earliest works of Greek architecture on any real scale.
Chersiphron may well have visited the temples of Thebes in Egypt and been inspired by the forests of columns there. His temple of Artemis would be built entirely from marble and have 126 giant columns. Chersiphron's first challenge was to ensure a constant supply of enormous blocks of marble. The quarries were 7 miles from the construction site, and some marble blocks could weigh as much as 40 tons. Engineer Scott Steedman has examined the difficulties of moving them.
There's a lot of controversy about how the ancients moved heavy stones. We know that they dragged them, of course, but when you drag a stone, you have to overcome a huge amount of friction from the weight of the stone on its runners underneath. So if you want a system that doesn't involve dragging, then you may be able to rock them, or even to roll them. This is a mock-up of a rocking device where the stone is strapped in between 2 large wooden rockers. This is a very efficient system of overcoming friction, and you can see just how easy it is to move even a heavy object. You could maneuver it, you could spin it, you could pull it up a ramp with considerably fewer men than if you were trying to drag it.
Chersiphron's methods of moving stone were highly advanced. He invented an ingenious roller pulled by oxen.
The circular column elements were simply rolled along the ground within a frame pulled by oxen. But the rectangular elements were, of course, a rather more difficult proposition. And some of these were enormous. I mean, the largest of the architraves was nearly 9 meters long, which is an enormous block of stone. And to move that, he encased the ends in timberwork and turned them into wheels, and then simply attached draft animals to them and pulled them along.
The temple measured a vast 180 by 360 feet, almost twice the size of the Parthenon. It was surrounded by a double row of columns, 60 feet high. One of the biggest problems was lifting up the giant lintels to the column tops.
Stones like these weigh as much as 5 to 10 tons apiece. So how did the ancient Greeks lift such enormous weights to the top of a temple? We know that in ancient Egypt they used a form of cantilever crane called a shadoof to lift water. And we know that the ancient Greeks used the same principle but on a much larger scale to lift weights at the dockside, cargo and even ships. So we can imagine that it's entirely possible that they used the same type of cantilever crane inside the temple, perhaps mounted on a mound of earth and stone, so that they could build up a platform halfway up the temple to give them the leverage they would need to reach right to the top.
Unlike earlier civilizations, Chersiphron's craftsmen had iron tools. This enabled the marble columns to be fluted and decorated, but it called for greater care in handling them.
One of the great difficulties of maneuvering these enormous blocks of stone is the precision that you need to get them finally into their exact place in the building. And you want techniques that can allow fine-tuning and allow little shifts of position and so on.
Chersiphron had to ensure the 40-ton marble lintels were placed in exactly the right positions, or the whole temple could collapse like a house of cards. He contemplated suicide when faced with lowering the final section. A similar problem had once confronted the ancient Egyptians when lowering a 60-ton sarcophagus down a 30-meter shaft. Their solution was simple.
They fill the shaft with sand, and they put the sarcophagus above the sand, and they cut a side shaft, and they take the sand from the side shaft, the sarcophagus will go down.
Chersiphron adapted this Egyptian technology to solve his problem.
One of the techniques Chersiphron used was to build a mound of sacks of sand, basically, and to put the architrave on that. And then by pulling away the sand at the base, the architrave is slipped slowly into position. And of course, this can be manipulated quite precisely and quite carefully.
The sand was let out of the bags, slowly lowering the stone into position. The Temple of Artemis took 50 years to build, and Chersiphron didn't live to see its completion. His son followed him to finish the construction. The temple became a massive tourist attraction. Then, on the night of Alexander the Great's birth, tragedy struck. On the night of Alexander the Great's birth, legend records that the goddess Artemis left the great temple to be with him. While she was away, a pyromaniac, wanting his name to be remembered forever, burned the temple to the ground.
In the year 356 BC, there was what the sources describe as a madman, Herostratus, who was, it says, consumed with the desire for glory, that his name should be remembered to the ends of time, on the ends of the earth. And he burnt the temple down.
The temple had a wooden roof and staircase. Once a falling beam had toppled a column, collapse was inevitable. Although the pyromaniac's name was erased from all records for his appalling crime, the word Herostraton has remained to describe infamy. But the Temple of Artemis had a second life. Within decades, it was rebuilt, becoming one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. During its reconstruction, Alexander the Great conquered every country around the eastern Mediterranean, bringing 2 ancient civilizations into the Greek Empire, Babylonia and Egypt. The capital of Egypt is Cairo, home to the oldest wonder of the world. The Great Pyramid still lies at the heart of Egyptian culture. On the edge of the city lies the Giza Plateau, the site of a vast pyramid complex. Pyramids are the tombs of the pharaohs. Pointing to the heavens, they ensured the pharaoh's safe journey into the next world. The pharaoh was buried deep inside in a hidden tomb chamber. In death, as in life, he was worshipped, feared, and respected. Out of the 80 pyramids in ancient Egypt, the Great Pyramid is the largest. It was built in 2560 BC for the pharaoh Khufu. Like all pharaohs, Khufu was more than a king. The Egyptians believed he was the living image of a god come down to earth. The Great Pyramid is the largest stone structure in the world. It dwarfs all comparisons. Nearly as tall as the Washington Monument, 5 cathedrals can fit within it. Yet it was constructed without machinery or even iron tools. How were the ancient Egyptians able to build it? In the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus tried to find the answer. He gathered his information from the hearsay of local priests. The account he has left us is unreliable.
The pharaoh Khufu compelled his subjects to labor as slaves for his own advantage. Some were forced to drag blocks of stone from the quarries in the Arabian hills to the Nile. The work went on in 3 monthly shifts, 100,000 men in a shift.
The wickedness of Khufu is not something that you can regard, in Herodotus' telling at any rate, as something which is hard historical fact. It is anything but that.
Herodotus's inaccuracies were exaggerated throughout the Christian era and later popularized by Hollywood.
Producers, when they make this type of movies, they showed slavery building the pyramid. You know, slavery can build a huge building, but it will never make anything genius. But if you do something with love and you believe that this is the tomb of the king who will be a god, you will do it.
Guaranteeing the successful passage of the pharaoh into the next world was every Egyptian's duty.
Peasantry was called up on national service to work on these things, because slaves, of course, were not involved. The Egyptians did not have, in the Greek or Roman sense, a slave system at all.
Although slavery didn't exist, workers were conscripted like an army. During the annual floods, farmers worked on the pyramids, which was preferable to going hungry.
For all its faults, the Egyptian governmental system was one of the most successful that human history has to show. It was a governmental system that lasted well in excess of 3,000 years. And systems will only last as long as there is a degree of acquiescence on the part of the subject peoples.
The Great Pyramid was built with over 2 million stone blocks. Building the pyramid was the greatest feat in architecture. But did it really take 100,000 men to build it? The Egyptians were practiced in pyramid building. Their production line ran highly efficiently. Instead of Herodotus's 100,000 slaves, only 20,000 laborers were used. In place of soldiers with whips, help was at hand to tend the sick and injured.
The Egyptians put doctors, physicians on the site to save the workmen, because they found many workmen had broken hands, and they put wood to support the broken hands. Others had broken legs. We found that all the tombs of men and women, the skeletons, had stress on their back because they were involved in moving heavy stuff, and they died during the construction of the pyramids.
The Giza Plateau was chosen as the site because of the quantity and quality of the building stone. The men lived here in laborers' quarters, their heads shaven to deter lice. Working in gangs, they hauled the stone blocks from the nearby quarry on sledges. An illustration from the tomb of a nobleman shows this process on a grand scale. A colossus being dragged along. Sleepers or runners were often set into the ground to reduce friction, but there were no rollers under the sledge.
I know that Hollywood, the Technicolor industry, is very keen on rollers. You can get lots of Israelites squashed under things like rollers, and it makes for good copy. But there's no sign of any roller at all. And standing on the knee, there is somebody clapping his hands and saying, as the Egyptian text indicates, Jehuti hoppe meri nesu, which is one Egyptian equivalent of what shall we do with the drunken sailor. It ensures that everybody pulls at the right time. It gives a rhythm to the whole operation.
The lower part of the Great Pyramid used the largest blocks, weighing 5 tons or more. Although a stone block was fitted into place every 2 minutes, the Great Pyramid took 23 years to build.
Provided the Egyptians had time, and provided they had their disciplined workforce and these techniques, they could achieve what they needed to achieve.
Even today, the building of the Great Pyramid remains the most incredible story in the history of architecture, the foundation for all the wonders to come.